Waitress spills Coca-Cola on black man. His true identity shocked everyone. In a bustling New York City restaurant, a simple accident triggers a series of events that expose deep-rooted prejudices and reveal surprising secrets. When a young waitress accidentally spills Coca-Cola on a black customer, no one could predict the shocking consequences that would follow, nor the true identity of the man who would change everyone's lives forever. Dear viewers, if you're about to dive into this moving story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to never miss any of our impactful narratives. And don't forget to comment which city you're watching this story from, a story that promises to change your perspective. Shall we begin? The buzz of the Melting Pot, a high-end restaurant in the heart of Manhattan, was like an urban symphony during the lunch rush. Tables occupied by hurried executives, boisterous families, and couples on discreet dates created a mosaic of New York life. Amidst this organized chaos, Sarah, a 23-year-old waitress with curly hair, tied in a messy bun, navigated between tables with the dexterity of someone who knows every inch of the place. On the other side of the dining room, a black man in his early 40s entered the establishment. Dressed in an impeccable suit that contrasted with his dark skin, he exuded an aura of authority that made several patrons turn their heads. His name was Marcus, though no one there knew him yet. Sarah, balancing a tray with glasses of Coca-Cola, hurried to serve a table when her gaze crossed with Marcus's. For a brief moment, something in that look disturbed her, causing her to lose her balance. In slow motion, the glasses toppled, spilling their dark contents directly onto Marcus's immaculate suit. The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to the scene, expectant. Sarah, mortified, began to stammer apologies, her hands trembling as she tried to clean up the mess with napkins. Marcus, on the other hand, remained strangely calm, his eyes fixed not on his ruined clothes, but on Sarah's terrified face. It was then that the shrill voice of the manager, Mr. Thompson, cut through the air. "Sarah, you walking disaster, how could you be so clumsy?" He approached, his face red with anger, completely ignoring Marcus. "How many times do I have to tell you to pay attention? This is coming out of your paycheck." The injustice of the situation hung in the air like a bad omen. Meanwhile, in the back of the restaurant, Mrs. Johnson, the chef who had been working there for decades, observed the scene with narrowed eyes. Something about that man seemed familiar to her, a distant memory she couldn't quite reach. Marcus, still without saying a word, raised his hand in a gesture that silenced the manager. His gaze now was one of pure determination. "Sir," he finally spoke, his voice calm but laden with authority, "I believe we have a more serious problem than a stained shirt." The manager, belatedly realizing his error, began to stammer apologies. But Marcus wasn't interested. His eyes turned back to Sarah, who was still trembling slightly. "What's your full name, young lady?" Sarah, surprised by the question, hesitantly replied, Sarah Miller." A flash of recognition passed through Marcus's eyes, so quick that no one except Mrs. Johnson, still watching attentively, noticed. At that moment, it became clear that this incident was just the beginning of something much bigger. The Melting Pot was about to become the stage for a story that no one there could have predicted. The Melting Pot wasn't just another restaurant in bustling Manhattan. Located in the heart of the financial district, it was a reflection of the city itself, a blend of tradition and modernity, where Wall Street executives mingled with tourists and aspirational middle-class diners. The exposed brick walls contrasted with contemporary decor, creating an atmosphere that attracted both conservatives and trendsetters alike. Sarah Miller, the young waitress, was not a typical employee. A recent graduate from NYU with a degree in fine arts, she carried the weight of student loans and unfulfilled expectations. Her work at the restaurant was seen by her as a temporary humiliation, a necessary step to fund her true passion, painting. Her surface charm masked a heart hardened by the harsh realities of New York City life and her own unfulfilled ambitions. Mr. Thompson, the manager of the Melting Pot, epitomized the man who sold himself as apolitical, but whose actions revealed a deep compliance with discriminatory status quo. With over 2 decades in the hospitality industry, he had perfected the art of pleasing the right customers, even if it meant turning a blind eye to injustices or worse, actively perpetuating them. In contrast, Mrs. Johnson, the middle-aged chef, was the beating heart of the restaurant. Originally from New Orleans, she had arrived in New York as a young woman, bringing with her traditional recipes that had made the Melting Pot famous. Her dark skin and graying hair bore witness to a life of hard work and silent resistance against the prejudice she faced daily. Marcus, the man on whom Sarah had spilled the Coca-Cola, was an enigmatic figure. His impeccable suit and confident posture suggested success, but there was a depth in his eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond the corporate world. Born and raised in Harlem, Marcus had overcome countless obstacles to get where he was, carrying with him memories of a childhood marked by poverty and discrimination. The incident at the restaurant brought to the surface social dynamics long established in New York City. Known for its diversity and opportunities, the city was also a stage for profound inequalities and veiled prejudices. The Melting Pot, with its diverse clientele, had become a microcosm of these social tensions. As news of the incident spread through the restaurant, diverse reactions could be observed. A group of executives at a nearby table exchanged looks of disapproval, not for the act itself, but for the scene it caused. A young couple, visibly uncomfortable, debated in whispers whether they should intervene or remain silent. At the bar, a middle-aged man commented quietly to the bartender, "These people just don't know their place, do they?" The tension in the air was palpable, reflecting the racial and social complexities of a city that prided itself on its progressiveness, but still grappled with ghosts of the past. The incident with Marcus wasn't an isolated event, but rather the spark that could ignite a series of latent conflicts ready to explode. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Mrs. Johnson observed everything with keen eyes. Her mind wandered to memories from decades ago when she herself had faced similar situations. There was something familiar about Marcus, a reminiscence she couldn't quite decipher, but which deeply unsettled her. As the scene unfolded, other characters emerged, each with their own stake in the unfolding drama. There was Jack, a regular customer and influential food critic whose review could make or break the restaurant. His fingers hovered over his phone, unsure whether to start tweeting about the incident or not. At a corner table, Congresswoman Eleanor Hayes, known for her work on civil rights legislation, watched the scene unfold with growing interest. She had chosen the Melting Pot for a quiet lunch away from the political spotlight, but now found herself in the middle of a situation that echoed the very issues she fought against in Washington. As Marcus calmly stood, adjusting his stained suit, it became clear that his reaction would not be the expected one. His determined look suggested that he wasn't there by chance, and that the incident with Sarah was just the beginning of something much bigger. The Melting Pot, and by extension New York City itself, was about to face a turn of events that no one could have predicted. Marcus rose slowly, his eyes scanning the restaurant. The silence was palpable, broken only by the occasional clink of cutlery. With a calm but firm voice, he addressed Mr. Thompson. "Sir, I'd like to speak with the owner of this establishment." The manager, visibly nervous, stammered, I'm in charge here. Perhaps we can resolve this discreetly." Marcus smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I believe discreetly is no longer an option, is it?" At that moment, Sarah, regaining her composure, intervened. "It was an accident. You can't prove anything different." Sarah's bold statement provoked diverse reactions in the restaurant. Some customers murmured in agreement, others seemed shocked by her lack of remorse. Marcus, however, maintained his composure. "Ms. Miller," he said, emphasizing the surname, "I believe you gravely underestimate the situation you find yourself in." The use of her surname caught Sarah by surprise. She exchanged a worried look with Mr. Thompson, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Marcus continued, "I imagine you're not familiar with the recent changes in legislation regarding racial discrimination in commercial establishments." He pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to the manager. "I'm Marcus Washington, Assistant U.S. Attorney specializing in civil rights and racial discrimination cases." The shock was immediate. Mr. Thompson paled, Sarah took a step back, and a murmur of surprise ran through the restaurant. Seizing the moment, Marcus raised his voice so everyone could hear. "What happened here today wasn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a systemic problem that persists in our society. And today, we're going to start changing it." He turned to the other customers. "Would any of you be willing to testify about what you saw here?" The silence that followed was deafening. People shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, avoiding Marcus's gaze. It was then that a firm voice was heard from the kitchen. "I saw everything." Mrs. Johnson emerged, removing her apron. "And it wasn't the first time I've witnessed something like this here." Mr. Thompson, recovering from the initial shock, tried to intervene. "Edna, you don't know what you're talking about. Get back to the kitchen." But Mrs. Johnson was unwavering. "No, Mr. Thompson. Enough of staying silent. Enough of pretending I don't see what happens here every day." The tension in the air was palpable. Other employees, encouraged by Mrs. Johnson's attitude, began to speak up, sharing their own experiences of discrimination at the restaurant. Sarah, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, tried one last gambit. "You can't do this. My father is a lawyer. He has connections." Marcus turned to her, his gaze penetrating. "Ms. Miller, your connections don't place you above the law. In fact, they make your attitude even more condemnable." At that moment, one of the customers, Jack the food critic, stood up. "Mr. Washington, I also witnessed the incident, and am willing to testify." Gradually, more people began to speak up, willing to recount what they had seen. The restaurant, which minutes before had been a stage for silent discrimination, now buzzed with voices of indignation and support. Congresswoman Hayes, seeing an opportunity to address the issue she had been fighting for, also stood up. "As a member of Congress working on civil rights legislation, I can assure you that what we've witnessed here today is precisely why we need stronger laws and enforcement." Mr. Thompson, seeing the situation completely out of his control, made one last desperate attempt. "Mr. Washington, surely we can resolve this another way. How about a settlement? I can offer generous compensation." Marcus looked at him with a mixture of pity and determination. "Mr. Thompson, what happened here today goes far beyond financial compensation. We're talking about human dignity, about social justice, and that, sir, is priceless." He then addressed everyone present. "What we've experienced here today is an opportunity to confront our prejudices, to question ingrained practices, and to promote real change. This isn't just about punishing those responsible for this incident, but about initiating an honest dialogue about racism and discrimination in our society." As Marcus spoke, the transformation in the environment was visible. People who had previously remained silent were now speaking up, sharing their own experiences and expressing support. The melting pot, a microcosm of New York society, was being shaken to its foundations. Sarah and Mr. Thompson, now isolated, watched helplessly as their world crumbled around them. The conflict that had begun with an act of discrimination was evolving into something much larger, a movement of awareness and change that promised to reverberate far beyond the walls of the restaurant. As the main conflict unfolded in the Melting Pot's dining area, several subplots began to emerge, adding layers of complexity to the situation. In the kitchen, away from public view, a tense scene was unfolding. Jake, a young line cook, confronted Chef Mike, the executive chef. "Chef, Mrs. Johnson is right. We can't keep quiet about what's happening here anymore." Chef Mike, a middle-aged man who had built his career at the restaurant, seemed torn. "Jake, you don't understand. Things are complicated. We have to think about our jobs, our families." This conversation revealed a deeper division among the staff, those willing to risk everything for justice and those too fearful to challenge the status quo. Meanwhile, at table 15, a discreet couple observed the events with particular interest. The woman, Rachel Goldstein, was a well-known investigative journalist for the New York Times. Her partner, David, whispered, "Honey, this is exactly what you've been looking for, your exposé on discrimination in upscale establishments." Rachel nodded, her eyes gleaming with the prospect of a big story. "Yes, but there's something more here. That prosecutor, I have a feeling I know him from somewhere." This subplot introduced a new element, the media. Rachel's presence promised to amplify the day's events to a much larger audience, potentially transforming a local incident into a national debate. At the bar, two figures watched attentively: Olivia Washington, a renowned civil rights attorney, and her assistant, Alex. "Ms. Washington, that's your brother, isn't it?" Alex asked, discreetly pointing to Marcus. Olivia nodded, a mixture of pride and concern on her face. "Yes, it's him. Marcus has always been the idealist in the family, but this time he might have bitten off more than he can chew." This revelation added a new dimension to Marcus's story. His confrontation wasn't just professional, but also personal, potentially affecting his family relationships and career. Near the entrance, a group of law students, who were at the restaurant to celebrate the end of their exams, began live-streaming the events on their social media. "Guys, you won't believe what's going down here," exclaimed Zoe, one of the students, as she narrated the events to her online audience. The rapid dissemination on social media added a time pressure to the situation. What began as a local incident was quickly transforming into a viral event, attracting external attention and raising the stakes for everyone involved. In a discreet corner of the restaurant, a man in a suit observed everything with interest. Richard Blackwell, an influential investor and regular patron of the Melting Pot, made a discreet call. "James, I think we need to reconsider our investment in this place. The situation is complicated." This conversation revealed the potential economic ramifications of the incident, threatening not only the restaurant's reputation, but also its financial viability. Mrs. Johnson, now at the center of attention, felt long-repressed memories surfacing. Looking at Marcus, she murmured to herself, "He reminds me so much of Samuel. Could it be possible?" This reflection by Mrs. Johnson hinted at a deeper connection between her and Marcus, a story from the past that could have significant implications for the present. As these subplots developed, the clock on the restaurant wall mercilessly marked the passage of time. It was almost 2 p.m. when the lunch rush usually died down, and the staff prepared for the lull between shifts. But today it was clear there would be no rest. Mr. Thompson, observing the chaos engulfing his once immaculate establishment, made a frantic call. "Mr. Carter, please come here immediately. Your restaurant is, well, you need to see for yourself." With this call, the stage was set for the entrance of another crucial player, the true owner of the Melting Pot, whose identity and reaction could completely change the course of events. As the tension in the restaurant reached a fever pitch, each character found themselves at a crossroads. Their decisions in the next few moments would not only shape their own futures, but potentially impact the broader conversation about race and discrimination in America. The sound of firm footsteps echoed through the entrance of the Melting Pot, instantly silencing the buzz that had taken over the environment. All eyes turned to the imposing figure entering the restaurant, James Carter, the owner of the establishment. Carter, a man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and an authoritative posture, scanned the room, assessing the situation. His gaze lingered first on Marcus, then on Sarah, and finally on Mr. Thompson, who seemed to have shrunk since his arrival. "Can someone explain to me what's happening in my restaurant?" Carter's voice was calm but laden with authority. Before anyone could answer, his eyes widened in recognition. "Marcus? What are you doing here?" The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus took a step forward, his expression a mixture of determination and a deeper, almost painful emotion. "Hello, Dad," Marcus said, his voice steady but with a slight tremor. "Didn't expect to find me here, did you?" The revelation fell like a bomb in the restaurant. Murmurs of shock and surprise ran through the room. Sarah, who until then had maintained a defiant posture, visibly paled. Carter, recovering from the initial shock, tried to maintain his composure. "Son, what does this mean? Why are you causing this scene?" Marcus didn't back down. "I'm not causing any scene, Dad. I'm here because your employee," he pointed to Sarah, "decided it was acceptable to discriminate against a customer based on the color of his skin. It happens that this customer is me, your son, whom you haven't seen in years." Mr. Thompson, feeling the situation was completely out of control, tried to intervene. "Mr. Carter, I can explain." "Silence!" Carter's voice cut through the air. He turned to Sarah. "Is this true? Did you deliberately assault my son?" Sarah, now trembling, tried to defend herself. I didn't know who he was. It was just a joke, a misunderstanding." "A joke?" Mrs. Johnson's voice rose from the crowd. "Years of discrimination, unfair treatment, and you call it a joke?" Carter looked at Mrs. Johnson, and for a moment a flash of recognition crossed his face. "Edna, you still work here?" "Yes, Mr. Carter, I'm still here. Long enough to see how this place has changed, and how it's remained the same in ways it shouldn't have." Marcus seized the moment to press forward. "Dad, this incident is just the tip of the iceberg. Your restaurant, which should be a place of hospitality and respect, has become a symbol of discrimination and prejudice." Carter seemed to be aging before everyone's eyes. He looked around, seeing the expressions on the faces of the customers, the employees, his son. Something seemed to break inside him. I didn't know," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. "How did I let this happen?" At that moment, Rachel Goldstein, the journalist, stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, Rachel Goldstein, from the New York Times. Would you care to comment on the practices of discrimination in your establishment?" The presence of the media seemed to wake Carter from his stupor. He looked at Marcus, then at Mrs. Johnson, and finally at Sarah and Mr. Thompson. His expression hardened with a sudden resolution. "Yes, Ms. Goldstein, I have a comment," Carter said, his voice gaining strength. "As of this moment, Mr. Thompson is relieved of his duties. And as for you," he turned to Sarah, "you're fired. I will not tolerate any form of discrimination in my establishment." He then addressed all present. "To all customers and employees, I apologize for what you've witnessed today. The melting pot will close its doors temporarily for a complete restructuring. When we reopen, it will be with a new zero-tolerance policy against any form of discrimination." Finally, he turned to Marcus. "Son, I know we have a lot to discuss and resolve. But if you're willing, I'd like your help to transform this place into the establishment it always should have been." Marcus, visibly moved, nodded. "It's a start, Dad. A start." As father and son faced each other, the atmosphere in the restaurant changed palpably. What had begun as an act of discrimination had turned into a moment of revelation, reconciliation, and promise of change. The melting pot and all present were about to embark on a journey of transformation that no one could have predicted when the day began. Congresswoman Hayes, seizing the moment, stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, Mr. Washington, I believe this presents a unique opportunity. Would you be willing to work with my office to develop this into a model for change that could be implemented nationwide?" As the implications of her offer sank in, it became clear that the events at the Melting Pot were about to have repercussions far beyond the walls of the restaurant. A new chapter was beginning, not just for the Carters, but potentially for the entire nation. In the hours following the dramatic confrontation at the Melting Pot, the repercussions of the incident spread like ripples in a pond, affecting all involved in profound and unexpected ways. Sarah, still stunned by her sudden dismissal, left the restaurant under the accusing glares of customers and former colleagues. Upon arriving home, she found her social media flooded with hate messages and threats. The recording made by the law students had gone viral, exposing her actions to millions. Within hours, Sarah went from a privileged young woman to the face of intolerance in New York City. Mr. Thompson, for his part, faced not only unemployment but also a crisis of conscience. Years of silent complicity with discriminatory practices weighed on his mind. He wondered how many careers and lives had been affected by his inaction. That night, he decided to seek psychological help to deal with the guilt and rethink his attitudes. For Mrs. Johnson, the day brought a mixture of relief and apprehension. Her courage in speaking out was praised by many, but she feared reprisals. However, an unexpected call from James Carter reassured her. Not only was her job secure, but she was invited to lead an employee committee that would help in restructuring the restaurant. Marcus and James Carter spent hours talking after the restaurant closed. Years of estrangement and misunderstandings began to dissipate. James, confronted with the reality of the prejudice his own son faced, committed not only to changing the practices at the Melting Pot, but also to using his influence to promote changes in other establishments. Rachel Goldstein, the journalist, spent the night writing furiously. Her report on the incident, published on the front page of the New York Times the following morning, not only recounted the events, but also contextualized them within a larger problem of systemic discrimination in the city. The article sparked a heated debate on social media and TV programs. The law students who filmed the incident saw their videos go viral. Overnight, they became influential voices in the movement against racism, receiving invitations for interviews and lectures. The sudden exposure forced them to reflect on their own attitudes and privileges. Olivia Washington, Marcus's sister, faced questioning at her law firm. Some colleagues pressured her to publicly distance herself from her brother's actions, fearing the loss of conservative clients. Olivia, inspired by Marcus's courage, decided instead to offer pro bono services to victims of racial discrimination. Investor Richard Blackwell, who initially considered withdrawing his support from the Melting Pot, saw a unique opportunity. He proposed to James Carter a partnership to create an investment fund focused on businesses that promote diversity and inclusion. The idea quickly gained traction among other investors. On social media, the hashtag #MeltingPotRevolution became a trending topic. People from all over the United States shared their own experiences of discrimination in restaurants and other establishments, creating a national movement for change. The mayor of New York City, pressured by public opinion, announced the creation of a task force to investigate and combat discriminatory practices in commercial establishments in the city. The Melting Pot case was cited as a catalyst for this action. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood where the restaurant was located, residents and local business owners were divided. Some supported the promised changes, while others feared the incident would tarnish the area's reputation. Heated debates occurred at residents' association meetings. Congresswoman Hayes, true to her word, began drafting new legislation inspired by the events at the Melting Pot. She invited Marcus and James Carter to testify before a congressional committee, bringing national attention to the issue. As the dust began to settle, it became clear that the incident at the Melting Pot had touched on a deep wound in American society. What began as an individual act of discrimination had transformed into a turning point for broader discussions about race, privilege, and social responsibility. For Marcus, James, and all involved, it was evident that the real work of change was just beginning. The challenge now was to transform momentary outrage into sustained action and lasting change. The Melting Pot was no longer just a restaurant. It had become a symbol of the ongoing struggle for equality and justice in America. In the weeks and months that followed the incident at the Melting Pot, a profound transformation began to take shape, not just in the restaurant, but in the lives of all those involved. Marcus Washington, determined to capitalize on the moment of change, dove headfirst into the process of restructuring his father's restaurant. He faced initial resistance from some longtime employees who saw the changes as a threat. However, his patient and inclusive approach began to win converts. One day, during a staff meeting, Marcus shared his own journey. "I grew up watching my father build this place, but I never truly felt part of it. Today, we're rebuilding not just a restaurant, but a space where everyone can feel truly welcome." James Carter, for his part, faced his own demons. Years of neglect and willful blindness weighed on his conscience. He sought professional help to deal with his internalized prejudices and began attending discussion groups on race and privilege. In an emotional conversation with Marcus, James confessed, "Son, I spent years building an empire, but I forgot to build a family and a community. You've opened my eyes, and I'm determined to do things differently now." Mrs. Johnson, elevated to a leadership position, flourished in her new role. She implemented a mentoring program for young employees from marginalized communities, offering not just professional training, but also emotional support. "When I started here decades ago, I never imagined I'd be in this position," she shared with her team. "But now, my dream is to see each of you grow and realize your full potential." The Melting Pot reopened its doors 3 months after the incident, completely transformed. The menu now celebrated America's culinary diversity, with dishes from all regions of the country and various immigrant communities. The staff was a reflection of New York's rich diversity, and a new zero-tolerance policy against discrimination was strictly enforced. On reopening night, Marcus and James stood side by side to welcome guests. The moment symbolized not just the reconciliation between father and son, but also a new beginning for the establishment. Sarah Miller, the former waitress, went through her own journey of growth. Initially resistant to admitting her mistakes, she eventually sought help to confront her prejudices. Inspired by her experience, she began working with an NGO focused on anti-racist education in schools. In a courageous interview with Rachel Goldstein, Sarah admitted, "What I did was unforgivable, but I'm determined to use my experience to educate other young people about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of empathy." Mr. Thompson, the former manager, spent months reflecting on his actions and omissions. He eventually found a new purpose as a diversity and inclusion consultant for small businesses, sharing his experience as an example of what not to do and how to change. "I spent years being part of the problem," he said during a workshop. "Now, I dedicate my life to being part of the solution." Rachel Goldstein, the journalist, saw her career take off after her coverage of the incident. She launched a series of investigative reports on racial discrimination in various sectors of American society, gaining national and international recognition. The law students who filmed the incident formed a social justice-focused media collective. They used their platforms to amplify marginalized voices and promote positive changes in their communities. Olivia Washington, inspired by her brother's courage, completely reoriented her legal career. She became a prominent civil rights advocate, representing victims of racial discrimination in high-profile cases. Investor Richard Blackwell saw his diversity and inclusion investment fund grow exponentially. The fund's success inspired other investors to follow suit, creating a domino effect in the corporate world. As time passed, the melting pot case became a case study in business schools and corporate training programs. It was a powerful example of how a crisis could become an opportunity for positive transformation. A year after the incident, Marcus organized a special event at the melting pot, bringing together everyone involved, from Sarah and Mr. Thompson to the students who filmed the incident. The event celebrated the progress made and acknowledged the work that still needed to be done. In his speech, Marcus reflected, "A year ago, we were divided by prejudice and ignorance. Today, we are united in our determination to create a more just and inclusive world. Our journey is far from over, but every step we take brings us closer to the kind of society we want to build." Congresswoman Hayes, also present at the event, announced that the legislation inspired by the melting pot incident had passed, creating stricter regulations against discrimination in public accommodations and workplaces. As the guests applauded, it was evident that the incident at the melting pot had become more than just a moment of crisis. It was now a symbol of hope, a reminder that change is possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. For Marcus, James, and all involved, the transformation of the melting pot was just the beginning. They had started a movement that was spreading across the nation, challenging long-held prejudices and inspiring others to take action in their own communities. 2 years after the incident that transformed the melting pot and shook New York City, the city was preparing for an unprecedented event. The restaurant, now a symbol of change and inclusion, would be the stage for the launch of a national initiative against racism and discrimination. Marcus Washington, in partnership with his father James, had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, bringing together business leaders, politicians, activists, and celebrities to create the Coalition for a Prejudice-Free America. The launch event at the melting pot promised to be a milestone in the fight for civil rights in the country. In the days leading up to the event, tension was palpable. Marcus, now a respected public figure, alternated between press interviews and last-minute meetings with his team. "We can't fail," he told Mrs. Johnson during a break. "This event isn't just about us or the restaurant. It's about giving hope to millions of Americans who face discrimination daily." Johnson, now general manager of the melting pot, nodded wisely. "Son, you've already done more than many would in a lifetime. But remember, this is a marathon, not a 100-meter dash." Meanwhile, James Carter coordinated the event logistics with an energy that surprised even his closest collaborators. The man who once hid behind his ignorance was now at the forefront of change. "Every detail matters," he instructed his team. "From the menu, we'll serve to the seating arrangement. We want everyone to feel represented and valued." Rachel Goldstein, whose series of reports on discrimination had recently won a Pulitzer Prize, prepared to moderate the main panel of the event. She knew the discussions would be heated and potentially controversial. "We need to go beyond nice words," she told Marcus during a preparation. "People want to see concrete actions, real commitments." As the day of the event approached, unexpected challenges arose. A far-right group announced plans to protest outside the restaurant, claiming the initiative was anti-white. Authorities were alerted and security measures reinforced. Olivia Washington, Marcus's sister, and now a renowned civil rights lawyer, worked with the legal team to ensure the event was legally protected. "We can't let them intimidate us," she stated in an emergency meeting. "We have the right and duty to move forward." On the eve of the big day, news shook the team. Sarah Miller, the former waitress whose actions had triggered the whole story, asked to participate in the event. Her journey of redemption and anti-racist activism had gained national attention, and she wanted to share her experience. The decision to include her or not generated intense debate. Marcus, after long hours of reflection, decided to accept her request. Her story, as painful as its beginning may be, is a powerful testimony that change is possible, he explained to the team. On the night before the event, the melting pot was buzzing with activity. Chefs from all over America, invited to create a special menu celebrating the country's culinary diversity, worked side by side in the kitchen. Decorators gave the final touches to the hall, transforming it into a space that reflected America's cultural richness. Marcus made a final inspection of the venue, accompanied by his father, stopping at the exact spot where, 2 years earlier, Coca-Cola had been spilled on him. Marcus took a deep breath. "Dad," he said, his voice laden with emotion, "did you ever imagine we'd come this far?" James put his hand on his son's shoulder. "No, Marcus, you brought us here. Tomorrow, we'll take the next step together." As father and son contemplated the transformed restaurant, outside, the first protesters began to gather. Police cars patrolled the area and journalists set up their equipment. Meanwhile, in a nearby hotel, Congresswoman Hayes rehearsed her speech one last time. Her proposed legislation, inspired by the melting pot incident, was set for a crucial vote in Congress the following week. The success of this event could be the final push needed for its approval. In her room, Sarah Miller stared at her reflection in the mirror, rehearsing what she would say. Her journey from perpetrator to advocate had been long and difficult, but she was determined to use her voice for positive change. The stage was set. The stakes had never been higher. The event that could change the course of the fight against racism in America was about to begin, and all eyes were on the melting pot. The day dawned in New York City with an electric energy in the air. The streets around the melting pot were a controlled chaos. Protesters from both sides shouted slogans, journalists jostled for a better position, and a line of police officers formed a human barrier. Inside the restaurant, Marcus Washington was making final adjustments to his opening speech when he was interrupted by a visibly agitated Mrs. Johnson. "Marcus, we have a problem," she said, breathless. "Sarah hasn't arrived. No one can contact her." The news fell like a bomb. Sarah's participation, a symbol of transformation and redemption, was crucial to the event's narrative. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "We continue as planned," he decided after a moment of reflection. "If she shows up, we'll improvise." At 10 a.m. sharp, the doors of the melting pot opened. A diverse crowd of community leaders, business people, politicians and celebrities entered, creating a living mosaic of American society. The tension was palpable, mixed with expectation and hope. Marcus took the stage, silence falling over the audience. He looked at his father in the front row, receiving an encouraging nod, and began, "2 years ago, in this exact location, I was the victim of an act of discrimination that could have ended up as just another statistic. But today, we are here not to remember the pain, but to celebrate change and to commit ourselves to a better future." As Marcus spoke outside, the situation was deteriorating. Protesters opposing the event were becoming more aggressive, pressing against the police line. The noise began to infiltrate the restaurant. Rachel Goldstein, always alert, was receiving real-time updates on her tablet. She scribbled a note and discreetly passed it to Olivia Washington, who immediately left to deal with the situation. On stage, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "We're not here just to talk, we're here to act. Today, we announce the creation of the largest private fund to support anti-racist initiatives in America." At that moment, the restaurant doors burst open violently. Everyone turned, expecting the worst. But who entered was Sarah Miller, breathless and with red eyes. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, her voice echoing in the shocked silence. "I was detained by the police on the way here. Apparently, a black woman running through the streets of New York is suspicious." The irony of the situation was lost on no one. Marcus, quickly recovering, invited Sarah to the stage. She climbed up, trembling but determined. "I was supposed to be here to talk about change and redemption," Sarah began, her voice gaining strength. "But what happened today shows that our fight is far from over. My journey began with an act of hate in this very place, and today I'm reminded that the road ahead is still long." Her words electrified the audience. The event, which risked becoming just another well-intentioned conference, gained a palpable urgency. It was at this moment that James Carter, moved by a force he didn't fully understand himself, stood up and walked to the stage. Taking the microphone, he surprised everyone. "For years, I was part of the problem. My ignorance and my silence allowed racism to flourish right under my nose. Today, I announce that I'm donating 51% of the Melting Pot's shares to create an institute for training and empowering young people of color in the culinary industry." The announcement was met with thunderous applause. Marcus, moved, hugged his father on stage, an image that would be reproduced in newspapers and screens across the country. Meanwhile, Olivia returned, urgently whispering in Rachel's ear. The journalist stood up, asking for everyone's attention. "I've just been informed that the protests outside have turned into violent confrontations. The police are using tear gas." Panic threatened to take over the environment, but Marcus quickly assumed control. "This is the moment to show who we really are. We won't hide. Let's go out and face this together, peacefully." Led by Marcus, Sarah, James, and the other organizers, the event participants left the restaurant hand in hand, forming a human chain. They positioned themselves between the police and the protesters, chanting messages of peace and unity. The scene, broadcast live to the entire country, was powerful. Business leaders, celebrities, activists, and ordinary citizens, side by side, facing chaos with dignity and determination. Gradually, the tension began to decrease. Protesters on both sides, touched by the demonstration of unity, lowered their signs. The police retreated. In the middle of the street, Marcus Washington looked around, at his father, at Sarah, at the diverse faces surrounding him, and understood that this moment of collective courage and unwavering hope was the true climax of his journey. The fight was far from over. But at that instant, under the New York sky, a new page in American history was beginning to be written. In the weeks and months that followed the landmark event at the Melting Pot, the waves of change spread across America. What had begun as an isolated incident of discrimination in a New York restaurant had transformed into a catalyst for profound social transformation. The anti-racist fund announced by Marcus Washington quickly became the largest of its kind in North America. Companies from all sectors, pressured by public opinion and inspired by the Melting Pot's example, began implementing more robust diversity and inclusion policies. James Carter's donation of 51% of the restaurant's shares to create a training institute for young people of color in the culinary industry had an immediate impact. In its first year, the institute trained over 200 young people, many of whom were immediately hired by high-profile restaurants across the country. Sarah Miller, whose journey of redemption had captured the public imagination, became a sought-after speaker at schools and universities. Her story of personal transformation inspired many to confront their own prejudices and actively work to change them. The Melting Pot, now managed by a diverse team led by Mrs. Johnson, became a model of ethical and inclusive business. Tourists from all over the world visited the restaurant, not just for the exceptional food, but also to witness a living example of social transformation. Rachel Goldstein, the journalist who covered the story from the beginning, published a best-selling book about the case, detailing how a single event can trigger systemic changes. The book became required reading in journalism and social studies courses across the country. Olivia Washington, inspired by the events, was elected to Congress, where she became a powerful voice in the fight for stricter legislation against racial discrimination. Marcus Washington, reflecting on the journey 2 years after the original incident, found himself again at the melting pot, this time not as a victim, but as an agent of change. Sitting at a table with his father James, he observed the bustling restaurant, now a true reflection of New York's diversity. "You know, Dad," said Marcus, "when that Coca-Cola was spilled on me, I never imagined we'd get here." James, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and regret, replied, "Son, you transformed a moment of hate into a movement of love. You didn't just change this restaurant or this city, you're changing the country." As father and son shared this moment, outside, a new generation of young activists was gathering. Inspired by the melting pot story, they were ready to continue the fight for equality and justice. The journey was far from over, but the path ahead seemed clearer and more hopeful than ever. The bitter taste of discrimination was gradually being replaced by the sweet taste of change and the hope for a more just and equitable future for all Americans. The melting pot had truly lived up to its name, becoming a crucible where the best of America's ideals were being forged, reminding everyone that in diversity lies the nation's greatest strength. 5 years after the incident, the melting pot hosted a special celebration. Marcus, James, Sarah, Mrs. Johnson, and all those involved in the story gathered once again. The restaurant, now a national institution, was filled with diverse faces, each with their own story of change, inspired by the events of that fateful day. As Marcus observed the scene, a young waiter approached, accidentally spilling a drop of Coca-Cola on his shirt. The momentary silence was broken by Marcus's warm laughter. "Don't worry," he said, smiling. "Sometimes it takes a little Coca-Cola to start a revolution." The room erupted in laughter and applause, a testament to how far they had come and the journey that still lay ahead. Dear viewer, this story shows us that change begins with each of us. If you were touched by this narrative, share it, discuss it, and most importantly, act against prejudice in your daily life. Together, we can create a more just and inclusive world. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more inspiring stories like this. Thank you for watching.